July 21, 1944. The lagoon at Guam, Mariana Islands. The water churned white as the strange machines emerged from the reef, moving through the surf with a deliberate mechanical certainty that defied everything the Japanese defenders had been taught about naval assault. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto watched through his binoculars from a concrete pillbox 300 yards inland, his hands tightening on the steel frame as he counted the vehicles breaking through the waves. They were tanks, unmistakably tanks with turrets and treads, but they floated. They moved through water that should have drowned them, crossing the coral shelf that Japanese planners had designated as impassable to armored vehicles, approaching the beach with their guns already firing at prepared positions. The sound reached him a moment later, the grinding of steel tracks meeting sand, the bark of 75mm cannons, the steady mechanical growl of engines designed to operate in an element where engines should not function. Yamamoto had studied the American landing at Tarawa 7 months earlier. The intelligence reports had been clear. American Marines had died by the hundreds in the water, shot down as they waded from distant landing craft to beaches that naval bombardment had failed to secure. The reef had been Japan's ally at Tarawa, creating a killing zone where American courage could not overcome Japanese firepower. Guam's defenses had been planned with that lesson in mind. Let the Americans come ashore in vulnerable landing craft, let them wade through the shallows exposed and unsupported by armor, and cut them down before they could establish a foothold. The reef, the planners had assured him, would stop any tanks until engineers built causeways or the tide rose high enough for conventional landing craft. By then, Japanese forces would have concentrated their defense, would have time to bring forward reinforcements, would turn the beach into a graveyard. But the machines coming ashore were not waiting for causeways or high tide. They were already here, buttoned up and firing, providing mobile cover for the Marines who splashed ashore behind them. The impossible had become routine, and Yamamoto realized with cold certainty that everything Japanese defensive doctrine assumed about amphibious assault had just become obsolete. The vehicles were LVT-A4s, landing vehicle tracked, armored, the fourth iteration of a design that had transformed American amphibious warfare from a desperate gamble into an engineered certainty. The Japanese had laughed when intelligence reports first described American experiments with swimming tanks, had dismissed the concept as typical American excess, impractical engineering applied to problems that proper tactics could solve. Now those laughable machines were rolling over Japanese defenses with the inexorable momentum of industrial innovation meeting tactical rigidity.
To understand how amphibious tanks became the key to American victory in the Pacific requires understanding what the Japanese expected from naval invasion and how completely those expectations were invalidated. The Imperial Japanese Navy had studied amphibious operations extensively throughout the 1930s. Japanese forces had conducted successful landings in China, in the Philippines, throughout the South Pacific in 1941 and 1942. Their doctrine emphasized speed, surprise, and the vulnerability of forces during the transition from sea to land. The moment when soldiers left their boats and waded to shore was the moment of maximum exposure, when they were neither fully supported by naval fire nor established on defensible ground. Japanese defensive planning exploited this vulnerability. Position machine guns to cover the beaches, sight artillery to strike landing craft as they approached, build obstacles in the shallows to force attackers into predetermined killing zones, except that some attackers would reach shore but ensure that they arrived disorganized, unsupported by heavy weapons, vulnerable to immediate counterattack. This doctrine had worked at Tarawa in November 1943, where the 2nd Marine Division suffered over 3,000 casualties in 76 hours of fighting. The reef that surrounded the island had proven impassable to most landing craft at low tide, forcing Marines to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water while Japanese machine guns cut them down. The Marines who reached shore did so without armor support, without the heavy weapons that had been left aboard landing craft stuck on the reef. The battle became a brutal infantry fight, eventually won through courage and overwhelming numbers, but at a cost that shocked American commanders and the public. If every island required casualties on the Tarawa scale, the advance to Tokyo would drown in blood. What Japanese planners failed to anticipate was that the Americans would treat Tarawa not as an acceptable cost of victory, but as a problem to be solved through engineering. The solution was already in development, the amphibious tractor, known universally as the Amtrak, a vehicle that could carry troops or cargo from ship to shore without requiring conventional landing craft. The LVT-1, used in limited numbers at Tarawa, had proven the concept. Now the LVT-A4, armed with a 75mm howitzer and a fully enclosed turret, had transformed the Amtrak from a transport into a fighting vehicle that could provide fire support from the moment it left the ship until it reached inland objectives.
The design was distinctly American in its approach, not elegant but functional, not refined but effective. The LVT-A4 looked ungainly, a boxy hull with tracks that served as paddles in water and as propulsion on land. It was not fast, 7 miles per hour on water, 25 on land. It was not heavily armored. The turret could stop rifle fire, but not anti-tank weapons. But it worked. It gave assault forces the ability to cross reefs, to bring armored firepower to beaches before defenders could concentrate their response, to transform the vulnerable transition from sea to land into a mobile assault supported by organic fire support. The Japanese first encountered the armed LVTs at Kwajalein in February 1944. Intelligence reports described them with skepticism. Surely these were improvised modifications, not standard equipment. The numbers must be exaggerated. No military would build hundreds of specialized amphibious tanks for operations that might never occur. But at Saipan in June, more than 700 LVTs participated in the assault, and nearly a third of them were the armed variant. At Guam in July, the amphibious tanks came ashore in the first wave, their howitzers firing at pillboxes while conventional tanks were still being unloaded from LSTs. At Peleliu in September, at Iwo Jima in February 1945, at Okinawa in April, the pattern repeated. American forces arrived not in vulnerable boats, but in armored vehicles that could fight their way to shore, that made the beach itself a battlefield where defenders faced immediate armored assault rather than exposed infantry. The contrast between what Japanese defenders expected and what they experienced became a psychological weapon as devastating as the physical firepower. Japanese soldiers had trained for beach defense based on Tarawa's template. They expected to see landing craft approaching, to fire on vulnerable troops as they waded ashore, to exploit the critical minutes when attackers were most exposed. What they saw instead at Guam, at Tinian, at island after island, was amphibious tanks emerging from the water like mechanical sea creatures, already firing, already advancing, immune to the small arms fire that should have stopped unarmored troops in the shallows. The defensive plans that had seemed sound in briefings collapsed when faced with the reality of armored vehicles rolling across supposedly impassable terrain. A captured officer, interrogated after the fall of Tinian in August 1944, described the psychological impact. His unit had positioned machine guns to cover the beach approaches, had registered mortars on likely landing zones, had prepared obstacles in the shallows. When the assault came, the first wave consisted entirely of amphibious tanks.
They crossed the reef his commanders had designated as a barrier. They drove over beach obstacles designed to stop landing craft, and they began destroying his unit's defensive positions before a single Marine infantryman came ashore. By the time conventional landing craft arrived with the main assault force, his unit's defensive line had been broken by vehicles his training had never prepared him to counter. He had expected to fight infantry. He fought tanks and lost. The symbol that came to represent this transformation was the tank trad itself, specifically the distinctive tread marks that LVTs left on Pacific beaches, crossing from wet sand to dry, from water to land, physical evidence that the boundary between naval and ground warfare had been erased. Japanese defenders dug in behind beaches, confident that the ocean itself would protect their flanks, that amphibious forces would arrive exhausted and vulnerable. The tracks that crossed those beaches told a different story. American forces did not transition from sea to land. They operated across both mediums simultaneously, supported by vehicles designed to make that transition routine rather than exceptional.
The numbers tell the story of industrial capacity applied to tactical innovation. By 1945, the United States had produced more than 18,000 LVTs of all types. The armed variants, the LVT-A1, LVT-A4, and LVT-A5, numbered more than 2,000 vehicles. These were not prototypes or experimental units, but standard equipment issued to Marine and Army amphibious assault units, maintained by dedicated repair battalions, supplied with spare parts manufactured by the same industrial base that was producing conventional tanks, aircraft, and ships. The Japanese had perhaps 24 experimental amphibious vehicles, none of them armed, none of them produced in numbers that would allow operational deployment. The disparity was not merely quantitative but philosophical. Japanese military doctrine emphasized spirit over material, the willingness of soldiers to die over the tools they used to fight. American doctrine, exemplified by the amphibious tank, emphasized providing soldiers with every technological advantage that industrial capacity could produce. If a problem killed Marines at Tarawa, then engineers would design a vehicle to solve that problem. If beaches were vulnerable, then vehicles would be armored. If support weapons arrived too late, then amphibious vehicles would carry those weapons in the first wave. The willingness to innovate, to adapt, to treat casualties as unacceptable problems rather than inevitable costs drove American tactical development at a pace Japanese forces could not match. The transformation this created extended beyond amphibious assault. The presence of armed LVTs changed how Marines fought once they reached shore. At Tarawa, Marines had huddled behind seawalls, pinned down by Japanese fire from positions that naval bombardment had failed to destroy. At Saipan and Guam and Tinian, Marines advanced behind amphibious tanks that provided mobile cover and direct fire support, that could engage enemy positions without exposing infantry to return fire. The vehicles that had carried Marines across the reef now supported them inland, operating as conventional tanks in terrain where their swimming capability was irrelevant, but their firepower remained essential. Japanese defensive tactics, refined through years of combat in China and refined further after Tarawa, assumed that American forces would arrive on beaches disorganized and vulnerable, that the critical first hours of an assault would favor defenders who held prepared positions. The amphibious tank invalidated those assumptions completely. American forces arrived organized, supported by organic armor, capable of immediate offensive action. The first hours of an assault became a race to destroy LVTs before they reached defensive positions, a race that Japanese forces consistently lost because they lacked weapons capable of stopping armored vehicles in quantity. Anti-tank weapons, effective against conventional armor, often proved inadequate against amphibious tanks that approached from unexpected directions, that could maneuver through water to flank positions designed to face seaward. Japanese gunners trained to engage tanks attacking along roads found themselves trying to hit targets moving through surf, presenting deflection angles their training had never covered. The 47mm anti-tank gun, Japan's standard defensive weapon, could penetrate LVT armor at close range, but struggled to track targets that emerged from water, paused to fire, then reversed back into the surf before counterfire could be organized. By late 1944, captured Japanese defensive plans show increasingly desperate measures to counter amphibious tanks. Beach obstacles became more elaborate, extending farther into the water. Anti-tank ditches were dug behind landing zones, though these could only slow LVTs, not stop them. Suicide squads were organized to attack amphibious vehicles with magnetic mines, tactics born of desperation rather than doctrinal planning. None of these measures proved effective on a scale that altered operational outcomes. The amphibious tank, once laughed at as impractical American over-engineering, had become the vehicle that Japanese forces feared most in the critical opening phase of every invasion. The emotional weight of this reversal registered in Japanese military correspondence. A staff report from the 31st Army defending the Philippines in late 1944 noted that American amphibious capabilities had advanced beyond our capacity to counter with available weapons and tactics. The assessment was clinical, but its implications were devastating. Japanese forces could no longer prevent American landings, could no longer exploit the vulnerability of amphibious assault, could only hope to inflict casualties after American forces had established themselves ashore. The ocean, which was supposed to protect Japan's island empire, had become a highway for vehicles specifically designed to cross it under fire. The Marines who rode in LVTs understood what the vehicles represented, not elegance or perfection, but the practical application of American industrial power to saving American lives. The LVT was cramped, hot, loud, and frequently broke down, but it crossed reefs that would have drowned conventional landing craft. It provided cover where none existed. It carried wounded back through the surf to hospital ships. It embodied the American approach to warfare. If soldiers were dying because of a tactical problem, then industry would build a solution to that problem, would produce that solution in thousands, would make the exceptional routine. The Japanese had expected American forces to fight the way everyone had always fought amphibious battles, vulnerable during landing, dependent on speed and courage to overcome defensive fire, accepting heavy casualties as the price of establishing a foothold. What they encountered instead was an enemy that refused to accept those terms, that engineered around vulnerability, that brought armor to environments where armor should not exist. Every LVT that rolled onto a Japanese defended beach was a demonstration of industrial creativity applied to military necessity, proof that the rules of amphibious warfare were not immutable laws, but engineering challenges awaiting solutions. The larger truth that the amphibious tank illuminated extended far beyond Pacific beaches. The Japanese Empire had built its defensive perimeter on geographic assumptions, that oceans were barriers, that islands were fortresses, and the vast distances of the Pacific would exhaust American logistics and blunt American power projection. These assumptions were not unreasonable. They had protected Japan for centuries, but they depended on warfare remaining bounded by traditional limitations, on naval assault continuing to require the same vulnerable transition from ship to shore that had characterized amphibious operations since antiquity.
The Americans, characteristically, had looked at those traditional limitations and asked not how do we accept them, but how do we eliminate them. The amphibious tank was the answer to that question. Not the only answer, but perhaps the most visible, the most tangible evidence that American warfare operated on different assumptions than its enemies expected.
Where Japanese doctrine emphasized adapting soldiers to circumstances, American doctrine emphasized changing circumstances to protect soldiers. Where Japanese planning accepted casualties as inevitable, American engineering treated casualties as failures demanding correction. The track marks on Pacific beaches told this story more eloquently than any after-action report. They recorded the path of vehicles that should not exist, crossing barriers that should have been impassable, reaching objectives that should have required hours of bloody fighting. They mapped not just tactical advances, but philosophical differences, the difference between accepting the world as it is and reshaping it to serve your purposes, between fighting with what tradition provides and building what necessity demands. When the war ended and the amphibious tanks returned to depots, converted to peacetime uses or scrapped as obsolete, they left behind a legacy that transcended their mechanical specifications. They had proven that innovation could save lives, that industrial capacity could be channeled toward protecting soldiers rather than merely arming them, that the barriers which seemed absolute to one military could be merely inconvenient to another with different engineering priorities. The Japanese had laughed at swimming tanks because they seemed absurd, excessive, quintessentially American in their disregard for elegant simplicity. But those absurd machines had rolled over Japanese defenses from Kwajalein to Okinawa, had turned amphibious assault from a desperate gamble into an engineered certainty, had transformed the Pacific from Japan's defensive moat into America's invasion highway. The laughter had died somewhere in the surf at Guam, drowned by the sound of tank engines that ran in water as reliably as they ran on land, silenced by the demonstration that what seemed impossible to Japanese planners was merely Tuesday morning for American Marines and the vehicles that carried them to victory.
The beaches are quiet now, the tracks long since washed away by tides that care nothing for history. But the lesson remains, written not in sand, but in the record of battles won by forces that refused to accept the enemy's assumptions about what was possible. The amphibious tank was never beautiful, it was never refined. It was simply the tool that American industry built to solve the problem of how to land on hostile shores without drowning men in the attempt. That it worked, that it saved lives, that it won battles, these were not accidents, but evidence of a nation that treated obstacles as challenges awaiting engineering solutions rather than as immutable constraints on military action. The Japanese had defended their islands believing that the ocean was their ally, that geography itself would protect them. They learned, across dozens of bloody beaches, that the ocean was neutral, neither ally nor enemy, but simply a medium that American engineers had learned to navigate, to fight across, to make irrelevant through the simple expedient of building vehicles that treated the boundary between sea and land as a suggestion rather than a law. The tracks that crossed that boundary carried more than marines and ammunition. They carried proof that the future belongs not to those who accept limitations, but to those who refuse them, who build around them, who engineer solutions that transform the impossible into the routine and the absurd into the decisive.